The German Air Force, the so-called Luftwaffe, was created in 1935. Yet at the beginning of the Second World War, it was one of the best air forces in the world. This radically changed within just a few years. Let's take a look at the initial situation and the various shortcomings that ultimately led to its demise. In 1939 and 1940, Luftwaffe fielded some of the best airplanes of its type, notably the Bf-109 fighter, that could only be matched by the British Spitfire. The medium bombers Dornier 17, Junkers 88 and Heinkel 111 were also good if not great aircraft. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe possessed 500 transport planes and thus the largest air transport force in the world. Combined with the excellent paratrooper units, the so-called Fallschirmjäger, the transport arm was crucial for the early victories on the Western Front. In those days, the Luftwaffe was equipped and trained to defend Germany, win air superiority, and especially support the German army on its rapid advances. Although it was a very young air force, its pilot had the most combat experience due to their involvement in the Spanish Civil War, with a total of 20,000 men from 1936 to 1939. Now let's take a look at how this formidable young German eagle got its wings clipped and ultimately was reduced to a featherless carcass on the side of the road between London and Moscow. The first major shortcoming was the lack of a fleet air arm. Since the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, insisted that all planes are part of his Luftwaffe, the German Navy was dependent on his willingness to provide proper resources. The Battle of Britain should have not been fought over British airfields, but over British ports and the Atlantic Ocean, because the Royal Navy would have never let the German army set foot on the British Isles anyway. Yet, depleting Great Britain of vital resources by effectively disrupting incoming merchant shipping could have forced it into accepting a peace treaty. But Germany lacked a naval strike force and proper recon operations to support its submarines. To illustrate what a proper naval strike force could have achieved, let's take a look at the use of the Focke-Wulf 200, a passenger plane which was rather ill-suited for naval attack and military operations. But between August 1940 and February 1941, a force of around 30 of these planes destroyed 85 merchant ships. In comparison, the German submarine fleet destroyed and damaged around 350 ships in the same period. Considering the success of this force of ill-suited planes in small numbers, one can only imagine what would have happened with a properly equipped and trained naval air arm. The next major shortcoming was logistics. The logistical system of the German Air Force was focused on short campaigns. Due to the short effective range of most single-engine planes, the Air Force usually moved rapidly behind the army and used captured airfields for operations. Usually an airfield company could ready such an airfield in about 24 hours. This system was highly effective and allowed the Luftwaffe to fly more sorties than the British and French. Thus German air power was basically multiplied. Yet this support force was very dependent on transport planes to provide supplies. Its major drawback was that it was a rather fragile and specialized system and not suited for longer campaigns. A major weakness was the lack of proper repair facilities. Heavily damaged planes were usually loaded onto a truck and transported back to Germany for repair. This put the airplanes out of action for a long time. The system was also dependent on a good infrastructure and road system. This became apparent in the Balkan campaign, when the German Air Force was faced with major logistical problems due to the weak Greek road system and had to rely heavily on transport planes instead of supply columns. But Greece was small and the distances short, unlike the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the war against the Soviet Union, unlike the Balkan campaigns, wasn't a short campaign at all. This meant that by late 1941, less than 30% of the Luftwaffe forward air units were operational, while hundreds of planes were awaiting repairs. During the whole war and on all fronts, the serviceability rate of the Luftwaffe was 50 to 60%, in contrast to the RAF and US Army Air Force, which reached around 70 to 80%, due to their extensive maintenance and repair system. Whereas Allied planes that limped back to the airfields often could be made operational again, the Luftwaffe often couldn't even repair lightly damaged aircraft in the final years of the war. This became also obvious when the Allies captured Luftwaffe airfields that were littered with planes in various stages of disrepair. In 1943 and 1944, a third of the Luftwaffe losses were planes that had been abandoned on the airfields. I already did a longer video on the logistics of the German Air Force in World War II that covers several other topics. See the link in the description or click the picture on the screen. Another major problem was the mismanagement of aircraft design, development and production. Germany's aircraft industry was in an excellent condition in the late 1930s. During the first stage of the rearmament, only mediocre planes were produced. But the second stage saw already the very successful designs of the Heinkel 111, Dornier 17, Junkers 78 and especially the famous Bf 109. The problem was that Göring replaced the head of the Luftwaffe's technical office, General Wimmer, with his friend Udet. Udet was like Göring a World War I ace, but not suitable for overseeing the design and production of aircraft. One of the major problems with Udet was his insistence to make every bomber capable of dive bombing, which delayed or sometimes even doomed several designs, most notably the Heinkel 177, which had 4 engines located in 2 nacelles. This engine layout made the engines prone to overheating and engine fires, which earned the plane the infamous nicknames like Reichsfackel and Brennender Sarg, which means burning coffin. During the time of Udet, German aircraft were either delayed in development, production or of poor design, most notably the Heinkel 177, the Messerschmitt 210 and the Henschel 129. The only successful aircraft project during his time in office was the Focke-Wulf 190. Another major deficit was within the German aircraft and engine industry. It was not structured for a long war. The factories were small compared to the British and American ones, thus they were limited in terms of efficiency. This is clearly reflected by the lower per worker productivity of Germany versus the United States or the United Kingdom. Thus the early advantages in numbers were soon lost. Britain already produced more aircraft in 1940 than Germany. Finally, after Udet, Milch took over. He had experience with the aircraft industry and soon managed to improve the output and efficiency of the industry, but at that time it was too late. Some argue that the German economy was a bad mix between the private enterprise approach of the United States and the command economy of the Soviet Union. Thus it didn't possess the focus on efficiency of the states, nor the strong direction of the Soviets. The next problem was the reluctance of Germany to provide proper support for their small yet numerous allies, like Finland, Hungary, Italy and Romania. This was in clear contrast to the Western allies, who managed to support and thus use their allies in an effective way. Germany often denied licenses for planes and engines to several of its allies. For instance, Italy had a strong air force industry with excellent airframe designs, but these planes were usually underpowered due to the lack of proper engines. Yet Germany didn't provide any assistance in this matter, and when the Italians tried to buy engines, the Germans only provided a few. In terms of combat effectiveness, the Romanian and especially Finnish air forces achieved significant successes with the often lackluster planes against the Soviet Air Force. But Germany for a long time didn't provide them with proper aircraft. Instead, it supplied them with second-rate equipment. Thus the existing industrial capacity and sometimes Air Force personnel was wasted on and in inferior planes. This only changed in mid-1942, when Germany finally realized that the war wouldn't be a short one. Now the Luftwaffe also supplied its allies with the Bf 109, and in late 1942 licenses were granted to produce planes and engines. This failure to support its allies was in contrast to the Western allies, who managed to build up the almost non-existing Canadian aircraft industry, which provided many excellent aircraft for the war effort. The last and greatest failure of the Luftwaffe leadership was its inability to develop a proper training system. In the beginning of the war, Luftwaffe pilots were well trained and some also had combat experience from the Spanish Civil War. Although Britain initially sent its pilots into combat with less training than the Luftwaffe, the RAF early on introduced a vast training program. Similar, the United States began to set up a training infrastructure in 1940. The German training system was not a central part of the strategy. It relied on short campaigns. At the beginning of each campaign, the trainers were called to the front line. Because due to the lack of reserves of pilots and planes, the training schools were basically the reserve units of the Luftwaffe. In 1941, Germany already had a shortage of pilots and the training program was reviewed in order to reduce the hours to get the pilots combat ready. Whereas German pilots started as one of the best trained in the world, this situation started to change already in 1942. Let's take a look at some numbers. In 1940 and 1941, the average German combat pilot had 250 hours of flight experience before entering service, whereas the RAF sent pilots with 200 hours into combat. In the second half of 1942, the situation almost switched, with 200 hours for the German pilots and 300 hours for the British and American pilots. In mid-1933, the German number was reduced to 150 hours, and finally in 1944, German pilots had a mere 100 flight hours, whereas US pilots had around 325 and up to 400 hours of training. To conclude, although the Luftwaffe after 1941 fought against increasing odds, its own leadership was responsible for clipping its wings. Although Göring was crucial for the fast rise of the Luftwaffe, he also laid the foundation for its fall. By appointing unsuited friends, ignoring the demands of the Navy, and demoting highly capable officers to unimportant positions, the once young and formidable German Eagle was nothing less than a featherless, headless chicken by the end of the war. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. And see you next time.